what is actually this? What are we going to do tonight? This is the rough structure of the workshop. We will have a first part with our experts, and I see that Professor Götzl also joined us, which is great. We will have also time for Q&A, so you will be able to ask your questions to our three experts of tonight, and then we will go into the more interactive part where we will be using our Policy Kitchen platform and first look into the problematics that we see, the issues that we see on these four subcategories that we have defined. And then you will cluster in even smaller groups and find solutions or proposals for Switzerland to follow up on in 2023, 2024, and post these on Policy Kitchen. And the event is going to end at 9:30. Then we have there's more time to meet other people, other participants, and also exchange a bit on your discussions and ideas. We will create smaller breakout groups also for this. Now, a few words on the context of the Swiss candidacy for this non-permanent seat. In 2002, Switzerland joined the United Nations after the popular vote giving it the right to do so. It was a second popular vote, and it was a positive one in 2002. In 2011, Switzerland then formally submitted its candidature for a non-permanent seat at the UNSC in 2023-24. And in October last year, the FDFA, so the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, started its campaign called A Plus for Peace. Next year in June, there will be elections at the UN General Assembly for 5 non-permanent seats at the UN Security Council, and one of these seats is the one that Switzerland has applied for. What is actually the UN Security Council and what are its competencies? The UN Security Council is one of the 6 main organs of the UN, and it has the main responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. It has different instruments at its disposal. It can issue non-binding recommendations, but also decide upon coercive measures such as economic sanctions or military measures, which can take place in the form of peacekeeping missions, but also in some cases also military operations which are done by third parties. It can also do regional arrangements with certain international organizations such as the African Union, and it has special powers in the field of international criminal justice. Here, there's a concrete example would be the establishment of tribunals for the prosecution of war crimes, as we have seen it in the 90s for former Yugoslavia or Rwanda. And finally, it has also some procedural competencies within the UN system regarding notably the election of the Secretary General of the UN or the admission of new members to the United Nations. A few words about the composition of the UN Security Council. There are 15 seats at the UNSC. 5 of them are permanent members, and 10 of these are non-permanent members. And Switzerland, these non-permanent members are clustered around geographic definitions, and Switzerland is in the group of Western Europe and others. And with Malta, it has applied for one of these seats. Also, really shortly about decision-making procedures and pronouncements at the UN Security Council. Resolutions are the strongest form of pronouncements and decisions taken at the UN Security Council, and they can be legally binding according to international law. How is the decision-making process working? You need 9 votes to decide upon a resolution, to pass a resolution. And if the decision that is taken is non-procedural, it's substantial, then you also need to avoid a veto by the 5 permanent members, because they have a veto right for these kind of decisions. And of course, this is influencing the way that discussions are happening and decisions are taken at the UN Security Council. And before I end, quickly also an overview of the areas of work of the UN Security Council. It can work on country-specific items or regional items, but also work on more general and thematic areas. And this has been more and more the case in the last years. Amongst them, there's climate change and security, for instance, or food insecurity, and many others. And now, enough from my side. I'm really happy that now we have our three experts tonight with us to give us a bit of an overview, on the one hand, of the preparations of Switzerland, what is also being done at the UN, and how civil society is perceiving this candidacy, and also then this tenure that Switzerland is aiming at. We will start with Jonas Husky. He's the head. He's head of peace and security at the UN mission, the Swiss mission to the UN in New York. He has joined the FDFA in 2012, worked for some time at the Swiss embassy in Berlin, and then at the Human Rights Policy section in Bern. And since 2017, he's now at the Swiss mission to the UN in New York. And we're really happy that you could join us tonight, and that you join us from New York and take the time to share a bit your preparations in New York with us. You're at the center stage of the preparations, I would say. Thank you so much, Mr. Pasquier, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Fegert, and thank you to Foras for the invitation. It's good to see you also, Laurent and Annalena, around the virtual table, and also a few familiar faces from joining also from Switzerland. I will just start my the clock here so that I don't speak too much about those matters. As you can imagine, after 4 years really covering the council days and sometimes nights and weekends, I could speak about that for more than 5 to 7 minutes, but I'll stick to that today. I also before talking about how Switzerland and what would be important for Switzerland and what we are preparing for, and what kind of focus we are really putting on in our preparation, I will maybe start with a few, like building on your overall presentation on the council. I would start by outlining maybe 3 important aspects of how an individual member like Switzerland can influence the Security Council's work, and then turn specifically more to what is important for Switzerland in its preparation to first ever seat on the council. And of course, in the Q&A, if you have more specific questions on specific files at the council, or on specific preparations on Switzerland's side, I'm happy to take that as we move on to the more interactive segment. So the council as such, and what can an individual member do on the council? You had an overall introduction on that through my Ambassador Beresville. So I'll try to go more specifically into where I see elected members can make a difference and touch on some of those dimensions. You mentioned the overall. I'll start with the program of work. You mentioned the overall program of work. What is important to know is that if you take the program of work is organized on a monthly basis, with each month having a different presidency, but the presidency can still put a few issues on the agenda, a few priority issues. We have, for instance, Vietnam right now on the council as council president, and they've decided to have, for instance, a meeting on mine action to promote a more robust response by the UN in demining. Another meeting on the cooperation with regional organization, but there's very little actually at the end of the day that the presidency can do on the program of work. Like 80 to 90% of the program of work is actually set in advance from 1 month to the other. It's set by previous resolutions adopted that, for instance, foresee that every 3 months you'll have a briefing and an update on Afghanistan, that every month you'll have one on Israel and Palestine, and that 3 times a month you'll have one on Syria in different track of the file. So preparing for the council, as a matter of fact, is actually preparing for 80 to 90% of meetings and files that you don't get to decide individually. Yeah, well, I don't want to talk about that. It's on the agenda. You'll have to come up with messages on that one, with possibly concrete proposals, and of course trying to build something on the council based on your positions. The good thing being here, and it tends to be overestimated by those who says that Switzerland is a neutral country. It is a neutral country, but it doesn't mean we don't have a position on the international situation and on the most pressing crisis. So for most of those country files and those files, we do have established positions that we will need on the road to the council. We will need to kind of really be more concrete about and be more specific and really fine tune our messaging and trying to build on those positions. But so that's actually the program of work is an important way how to actually act as a council members. The other aspect, you've mentioned it also en passant, is the of course the formal resolutions and other councils product that can be adopted while on the council. And there's the important notion that actually in theory every member at any point can, as we say, take the pen, which means draft a resolution and propose it to the council. And in theory, that's a wonderful world. In practice, of course, politics play a big role because you need the authority to do that. You need to also withhold pressure depending on the files you want to propose a resolution. You need to withhold pressure by the permanent members, by the concerned country. I take, for instance, right now the example of the situation in Ethiopia, when there's a strong pressure from the region that the council don't do anything about this crisis. So that's a challenge. As a matter of fact, also the P5 and especially the Western P5, so the three Western permanent members, have over the years developed this so-called penholdership system, when they actually have asserted their authority for France to be dealing with Congo or Central African Republic, for the UK to be dealing with Somalia or Libya, and so on and so forth. So it's actually it's widely accepted among the council that those permanent members will be the one drafting resolutions on mandate renewals, will be the one drafting resolutions on sanctions committee, etc. Also because they've built a stronger expertise on those matters over the years. Obviously, they don't need to be out and in again on the council. But so that's when it comes to define individual the impact of individual members. Of course, the penholdership system is a potential hurdle. That being said, we've seen over the years elected members taking a leading role also on very, very sensitive files. I think you're familiar with the Syrian file, where for the humanitarian track of the Syrian file, the penholdership has been for years in the hands of elected members. Now it's Ireland and Norway, but it used to be Germany and Belgium before, and Sweden before them. So it's really something where they can assert influence. And of course, like I said, there are examples where elected members just take the lead and go for it, like Ireland on Ethiopia, as I just mentioned. They've just decided to take the pen and propose the adoption of a press statement on Tigray, which would be, if it goes through, a real breakthrough in terms of this issue not really being formally discussed on the council right now. And of course, if one elected members decides to put a resolution or any kind of council product on a thematic issue that can be done at any time in point. We had, for instance, Germany, who was championing climate and security last year. They couldn't have a resolution adopted because of the really no go by the US back then. But of course, they were ready to move on that. And the third part of it, and then I'll just move with a quick thoughts on Switzerland because time is flying. The third part of instruments that are very important for elected members are all the informal instruments. For instance, informal meetings that you can organize, informal coordination mechanisms, for instance, to reinforce the coordination among elected members to speak with one voice. This is definitely something that Switzerland contemplates in doing while on the council. You mentioned you need 9 votes to have a resolution. There are 10 elected members. So actually, if they all agree, they can block any resolution from being passed on the council. So for us, now in the preparation, I've already alluded to some of the key challenges, but some of the priorities that we will have in the months to come. First will be to define formally our priorities, what will be our overarching priorities on the council. This is a process we've initiated that is coordinated by our counterparts in Bern, and that includes the whole Bundesverwaltung. Based on that, then we will have to go for scenario on those priorities, also the ideal scenario of having a resolution adopted on X or Y or on any topics. But of course, we'll have to come with plan B on those priorities. I think an important part will be also to define how to best influence and be reliable and have a strong profile also in the way of doing things, being a bridge builder whenever possible between position. And I mentioned also the coordination among E10, among elected members. That's certainly something important, but also in terms of working methods, promote the inclusion of civil society, briefers, the greater interactions with regional organization, and so on and so forth. We will have also on the council, if elected, we will have 2 presidencies, one in 23 and one in 2024, which means during those months, we will have 80 or 90% of the program of work that we have to do it, and that's it. But we will have some room to maneuver to really do some agenda setting there. And that's definitely going to be two key moments for Switzerland while on the council. And very last, but certainly not least, for me, also from my very personal experience and perspective, I think one of the real added value of this, and one of the real chance if we prepare correctly and well to the council, is really to give a boost to our diplomatic service, to our internal processes, and to be really, because we'll be during 2 years really dealing with great powers with big powers on a daily basis. I shouldn't use a football analogy this week, but it would be kind of the Champions League of multilateral politics. And well, as you mentioned in your introduction, we've just joined the UN. So, I mean, relatively speaking, less than 20 years ago. So I think that would definitely be a boost for our internal structures as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pasquier, for this really insightful and practical overview of your work at the UN Security Council, that you foresee for the UN Security Council work, and the preparations, and thanks also for the analogy about the football analogy. Now I'd like to give, we'll have time for questions afterwards, but now I'd like to give the floor to Annalena Schluchter. She's Peacebuilding Officer at the UN Peacebuilding Fund. She previously worked also on gender and security at the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, and she will now give us also a perspective from within the UN, as a Swiss working within the UN. Annalena Schluchter, you have the floor.
Thank you, Moritz, and for us for organizing the event. I wanted to say thank you. That's really a cool initiative, I think, and also thanks for the participants for spending an evening with us. So yeah, as Moritz said, I think I'm gonna try and cover basically 3 main areas with my inputs to give you a little bit of an idea what my experience and perspective is as someone who works at the UN Secretariat on Peace and Security, how the Security Council influences our work and where Switzerland's influence could probably be felt in the years that Switzerland is on the Council. And finally, I would also like to discuss a little bit where work on peace and security happens beyond the SC across different bodies within the UN. So I work for the Peacebuilding Fund, the PBF, which is part of a bigger peacebuilding support office at the UN Secretariat. And the UN PBF is really understood as the main financial instrument to sustain peace in countries at risk or affected by violent conflict. And it is also, very importantly, an instrument of prevention. So before anything happens, the PBF wants to fill these critical peace-building gaps, act fast, and do that in a risk-tolerant manner where other donors sometimes might hesitate and not come in. So what we actually do on a day-to-day basis is that together with teams on the ground, we develop peace-building projects, and then we provide the funds to these peace-building projects. The majority of these projects are implemented by UN agencies like UN Women, UNICEF, UNDP, and so on. But we also fund projects that are implemented by NGOs. With an annual budget of around 200 million US dollars, we support projects in more than 40 countries. And of course, many of these countries are on the agenda of the Security Council, many of them permanently, as Jonas Husky explained. So in that context, in that peace and security dimension I'm working, how does the Security Council and what is going on in the Security Council influence our work? I would say the most important role for us is really the agenda setting that was discussed in the previous intervention. It's really the agenda setting, the priority setting, and also the influence that has on where resources are directed and dedicated, both financial and personnel, of course. And as you've heard, this happens on mainly 2 dimensions, country priorities, but also on thematic issues. So for the PBF to engage in a country, in a new country, we need to understand that this is a country that is a high priority for the UN, and being on or coming onto the agenda of the Security Council is probably the strongest indicator for that in that sense. But it is also important for us to understand where the Security Council sets priorities within specific countries that are on the agenda more permanently. For example, countries that have peacekeeping missions. What are the priorities of this peacekeeping mission, for whom, but also what are the gaps, and where is complementarity needed, and where is maybe peace building support needed. So especially interesting for us are actually discussions on so-called transitions. Transition contexts are country contexts where a peacekeeping mission is slowly planning, and it is often slowly, its exit. As for example, at the end of last year, when UNAMID it left Sudan, it's still ongoing, but the peacekeeping mission in Darfur. So this is a very crucial moment where the Peacebuilding Fund and the Peacebuilding Support Office more broadly is very interested in the strategies for follow-on sustaining peace solutions and the process of that. Just a word also on the thematic areas that are becoming increasingly more important and have a huge influence on setting the tone and the priorities for UN engagement on the ground. You're all familiar, I think, with the famous Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is very, very central to the PBF's work and where the money is allocated. But I wanted to give you just an example of another thematic area and another thematic agenda, which is maybe a little bit less known, but very important for us. And that is the Youth, Peace and Security agenda. And interestingly enough, the resolution 2250 on youth, peace and security was developed at the initiative of Jordan in 2015. So another non-permanent member that really managed to bring a thematic issue on the agenda of the Security Council, and then had really a landmark influence in peace building, strengthening programming to give youth a greater voice and role in peace processes. So such thematic initiatives really influence the way of working at the UN, and of course also beyond. And ultimately, again, I come back again to the money, also where the money goes and where issues are prioritized. And I think for Switzerland, this is obviously a really big opportunity to further develop existing thematic agendas that are already established, you know, at certain angles, but also introduce new thematic areas. More broadly, just one word that I also wanted to say is that I could also see how Switzerland could further strengthen the focus on prevention. The Security Council is still a body that is, you know, working in more of a reaction mode, and prevention is really where we see so much importance. If I have another short moment, I just wanted to finally give you some food for thought on another body that the Peace Building Fund is working extremely closely with on peace building, and that's the Peace Building Commission. The Peace Building Commission is an intergovernmental advisory body. It provides advice on peace efforts to countries coming out of conflict, or again, at the risk of falling into such a situation, and really serves as an open discussion forum. It has 31 member states, and Switzerland is a member in the PBC, has a very important role there. And there are always at least 7 member states who are members in the Security Council and in the PBC at the same time. So that's an interesting constellation, I think. So there are many differences, of course, between the Security Council and the PBC, but what is interesting, one interesting difference, I think, is that conflict-affected countries take the initiative and engage on a voluntary basis, really based on national priorities with the PBC, whereas countries are put on the agenda of the Security Council, right? Which sometimes has a negative connotation. And I think this is one of the complementarities, and maybe also one of the interesting dimensions where these two bodies can create some interesting dynamics, especially because the PBC does have a mandate to share advice with the Security Council based on the invitation of the president of the Security Council. The chair of the PBC can brief. So yeah, I think really the PBC is an interesting convening platform which can go a little bit beyond the very strict peace and security parameters, and can, you know, shed some different light on certain perspectives. There is also an informal coordinator that is a member state between the two bodies that organizes interactive dialogues, and more there seem to be really a lot of interesting ideas floating around on how to leverage the complementarity between these two bodies and their comparative advantage a bit more, and to make these engagements in a more efficient and consistent way. And I think with Switzerland's also track record on working on innovative working methods and building bridges, this could definitely be an area where Switzerland could push the envelope, and I'm curious to see how this is gonna pan out. And so with that, I stopped and am of course available for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Schluchterfelder, for this great overview of the work of your organization, and also showing how the UN Security Council is not working in silo, and its work is actually affecting other organizations and peace building activities on the ground. So good food for thought. I think also a lot of keywords for the next or subgroups then in the second part. Thank you so much. Again, there will be time for questions to Ms. Schluchter as well. And now I would like to pass on the word to Professor Laurent Goetschel. He's the director of Swiss Peace, a really important Swiss organization doing peace research and supporting peace-building activities on the ground as well. And he's also a professor for political science at the University of Basel. He worked for different academic institutions, such as the Harvard University and also the European Institute of Peace in Brussels. In 2003 and 2004, he also served as an advisor, political advisor, for the Swiss Minister of Foreign Affairs, Micheline Calmire. Yeah, Professor Goetschel, I'm really happy that you're here now to bring in a bit of perspective of civil society and your views on the candidacy and potentially the tenure then in 2023-24. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Moritz, and thank you also to all of you who are spending this early part of the evening with us, and to the two preceding speakers. So, I mean, there's a say in political science, foreign policy analysis, that actors tend a little bit to think and to argue depending on where they sit. So I think Jonas gave a strong focus on the Security Council, even though we are not in there yet, but that's his daily work. And Annalena gave a strong argument and perspective on the Peacebuilding Fund. And I'll now put on the hat somewhat of civil society, even though I'm not only working with civil society. But with this, we'll adopt maybe a complementary or slightly critical view, but I think this also helps complement the picture. So maybe to start with the UN as such. I mean, it has been characterized as an organization in very, very different ways, and I like formulas which go along saying, well, it's the best possible organization in the world as it exists, because it is somewhere between the monopoly of sovereignty and state interests, which we can very nicely observe right now in different parts of the world, unluckily. And on the other side, it's also not the panacea of world peace only, as a naive reader of the beginning of the UN Charter might think. So it's still representing very much the interest of states, and it's even representing much more the interest of strong states, actual strong states, or former strong states, states who still think they are very strong, as they are represented in the composition of the P5. And then it's also very bureaucratic. And this was maybe not the direct intention of Annalena when we were listening to her. But I mean, I fully understand, and there are great activities and particularly also great people working in these institutions, and fantastic work being done and programs developed. But the UN is heavy, and I think no one will contradict me. It's heavy, it's slow, and it's not really always extremely close to the people in the regions it is working with. So this is not at all a total critique, because UN is close with states, and states are still the most important actors in the existing world. But when we think and talk about peace building, people tend to be important. And whatever definition of peace building you adopt, particularly of sustainable peace building, or also if you think about dealing with conflicts, the so-called transformation of conflicts, there is always the society, civil society actors, local actors who come in. And these actors do have access in different ways to some of the UN agencies and institutions, at least. But let's say the Security Council is probably not the most accessible place to civil society actors. And I think Jonas will at least not contradict me fundamentally. Yes, there are other places of the UN where civil society has more access, but the UN is extremely relevant as an umbrella organization in regard to many conflicts and as a reference object for many civil society actors. So when one would be tempted to say, well, this is all bureaucracy, this is all heavy and slow and happening in New York and Geneva, and when in the field, rather in 5-star hotels and somewhere in a camp, then this is only part of the story. Because the UN is playing a role also in ways in which it is not immediately directly involved as an actor, but provides a reference object or an umbrella. And I'd like to just pinpoint 2 examples Swiss Peace has been involved in already in the past years and continues to be. And one of these examples is the conflict in Syria. And the negotiations, the so-called negotiations, because actually they never really started, but they are still being attempted in a certain way, which are taking place in Geneva between the Assad regime, which still happens to be the so-called legitimate government of Syria, and different actors of the opposition in Syria, with a special envoy of the UN. Staffan de Mistura used to be the most famous and long-acting one. Right now it's Mr. Peterson from Norway. And such negotiations, they take place among so-called track 1 actors. So governments and opposition, the main opponents in a conflict, even if sometimes, particularly on the side of opponents, they are not 100% defined. But then there are also many other actors involved in such a conflict, and actors which who, in case the conflict happens to be over at some moment and we think about rebuilding or transforming a country, will be very important. And for this reason, it is also very important that they can already be heard in one way or the other during such high-level exchanges taking place. And in such a format, Swiss Peace was tasked by Switzerland, but also Norway, later on Sweden, and also the European Union, to moderate a so-called civil society support room. This doesn't sound extremely sexy as an appellation. It wasn't our decision to call it like this, but actually it's quite transparent as an appellation, because at least at the beginning it was a room in the Palais des Nations in Geneva, which was accessible to invited civil society actors, but not always the same actors. So, I mean, many different actors have been invited to this room over the years. Over the years, it also became larger than this room, and it was eventually also transferred into a virtual room due to events we all know. And this civil society support room helped transmit messages from the track 1 level, so from governments and opponents negotiating, to a high variety of civil society actors who otherwise would not have had the possibility to know about what was going on. But what was equally important, and personally I think even more important, was the information transmitted the other way around. Because at the level of official negotiations, formally, they never actually really took off, even though indirect exchanges were happening in many different ways. And through the civil society support room, civil society actors had the possibility to convey messages, but they also had the possibility to talk to each other, to agree on certain priorities, be they linked to transitional justice, be they linked to economic recovery, be they linked to humanitarian needs, be they linked to perspectives about the future constitution, about the role of women in society, and many, many, many more issues. So this civil society support room is not a formal UN agency or actor. It is just hosted, literally hosted in the UN. It is not even being financed by the UN. It is financed by the other actors I mentioned before, but it is playing a very important role, giving civil society actors the possibility to be very close to exchange at the so-called track 1 level. This was an innovation, and if it will be repeated ever, we don't know, but it also shows that the UN is developing, is trying its best within the given circumstances, and that the UN is not only about states and complex mechanisms, but that it is also close to the field. And I think time is running, and I won't be too long, so I'll just touch one more word about a similar experience we've had. It started right after 9/11, when there were military and political interventions in Afghanistan. And as it happened sometimes, first the military intervention occurs, and then the UN finally manages to get to a resolution. It's not because the UN as such would be incapable, it's the fact that the UN is composed of states, and if some don't want, well, then certain things don't happen. But then the UNAMA mission started in Afghanistan, and we as Swiss Peace, in parallel, together with a German NGO, was tasked with establishing a so-called civil society platform. So it was not a room, it was a platform. It was also not just located in one place. It was trying to gather, to moderate, to train, also to discuss with different actors in Afghanistan, which could be assumed would be part of civil society if they were not living in Afghanistan, but in another place. It was a very funny experience. I remember at the first meeting we had in early 2002, an elderly man stood up and asked me, but now finally, please tell me who in Switzerland is president of civil society. Yeah? So it showed that there were varying interpretations of what civil society could be, could consist of, but also what could be the tasks and the mode of functioning of civil society. And there, UNAMA was working a lot with the civil society platform, because themselves, they were interested to know about the people. They were interested to also reach out to different constituencies, not limited to Kabul. Themselves, they couldn't do it for security reasons, but also for other political reasons. And so they were working with this platform, and they were then also contributing financially to this platform. And this platform actually still exists in a certain way, and there were other smaller platforms which were created out of this experience. This all to show, and I'll finish with this, that the UN is more complex, and let's say even more complex, and even more has even more facets than if one looks at the institution as they formally exist. And as an organization, it attempts to reach out. And even though the Security Council may seem sometimes very far removed from civil society actors, there are more and more attempts to establish certain linkages, to have information circulate also from the top to the bottom, but as I said, even more important, from the bottom to the top. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurent Goetschel, for these points, these critical points, but also showing that there's actually initiatives that are being developed to involve civil society, to work with different actors, and innovate also within this immense, huge body that is the United Nations system. Now we have time for 2 to 3 questions from the audience. If you want to ask a question to one of the 3 speakers, or 2 or 3 of them, this is now the moment. Just raise your hand, and then we can give you, I can give you the voice. Okay, if there's, I don't see anybody yet. Maybe to Mr. Pasquier, to maybe a question, maybe as a reaction to what Laurent Goetschel said about this bureaucracy and innovation within the UN Security Council's work. How an involvement of civil society, because Ambassador Beriswil also mentioned that Switzerland is pretty much willing to also use civil society as a multiplicator in its work. How do you plan to concretely do this, and what kind of where do you see that there's innovation that could be possible? What would Switzerland do in these 2 years?
Thank you for the very good question. And I'm seeing myself as Laurent said, as the defender of the Security Council and how relevant and perfect it is. So I'll continue along this line. No, very seriously, I would say for UN standards, I'd say the Security Council, just to begin with, it's pretty straightforward, and it's not as bureaucratic as some other parts of the system. And which allows member states, also for political reason, it has never really agreed on final and formal rules of procedures. These are informal rules of procedures, which is a pity on one hand, but which also opens a lot of space for innovation. Again, I'm talking about, in relatively speaking, with other parts of the UN system, as Laurent said, it's a big bureaucracy, and we know how that there are challenges related to that. So it actually gives individual members some room to maneuver. We saw that with the adaptation of the working methods to COVID. The council was actually pretty swift to move to a virtual mode and maintain continuity. But we can also see that in terms of the inclusion of civil society, a classical way of doing that is to invite civil society briefers to Security Council meetings, and we see there a very strong focus being done on some, for instance, the US and the UK. They had the presidency those last 2 months, and they really put a focus to invite women's civil society representatives from the field on all of the meetings they had during their months. So that was really an opportunity to give first-hand information by those representatives, but also for them, I worked before on the human rights policy. For those people briefing the Security Council, okay, it can expose them to kind of reprisals, but it can also legitimate their standing and their work on the ground towards the governments and the other actors. So that was actually, that's kind of a typical thing. What is actually more important is what also you would do about civil society inclusion. So and there we've seen also good practice by other members like Germany those last 2 years, who had regular briefings with civil society on their priorities, but also on the Security Council's agenda. They also had close consultations with civil society organization when drafting a resolution on women, peace and security in 2019. It did not end really well in terms of the negotiation on the council, but that was an important and inclusive way of doing things. So I think that there's definitely something where we could be inspired from and use a little bit those best practice. As Laurent said, just last but not least, the council is not the most forthcoming UN organs to civil society, and this also for political reasons. Also if you see a little bit the trend in the UN and of some authoritarian governments, if you see the trend with some of the P5, there's no wonder to that, but there's still some room to maneuver, and that we will use to its fullest.
Thank you, Mr. Pasquier, for this really comprehensive answer. Now we would have time for one more question before we dive into the active part. If there's a question in the audience, just raise your hand. And if not, you also have to, please don't hesitate if the question comes up later on, just send it to us and we can forward it to our speakers and then forward you the answer as well. I would like to thank our three speakers so much for taking the time and sharing their insights and their views.